Okay, so I would say welcome to the third talk of the day, and the topic on this is how is Zabbix doing? An outside look in English from Rihards Olups. I hope it's pronounced correctly.
In that direction, Rihards. Thank you. Good, I think, noon at this time, and my name is Rihards, and I'm a long-time Zabbix user. Very briefly about me, I had the honor to work at the Zabbix company for some 6 years. It's a great team, and before and after that, I put together a couple of books on Zabbix. I'm trying to find some time to write articles at zabbixbook.com blog, and I really like OpenStreetMap, so I'm trying to improve the map every now and then. And disclaimer right away. As mentioned, I moved away from the Zabbix company a couple of years ago. I'm still using Zabbix. I'm not affiliated with the company in any way. So I'll try to give you a fairly honest view of how I see the product, the processes, and everything else around Zabbix. And to start with some understanding what you think about Zabbix, who has never heard about Zabbix before? There's one person, he has never heard about anything. I've seen him in other talks. Okay, who is using Zabbix currently? There's a few.
Who has it installed and other teams using it?
Okay, so some people have installed it and others are using it, and there's like 4 or 5 people actually using it. So I'll try to more concentrate in this talk on new features in Zabbix. I will maybe less talk about the bases and the functionality as such. I'll try to have some introduction on that. But if you get some unclear things during or after the talk still, please catch me and ask me questions about this, and we'll get everything cleared up. And yet another question. So which country does Zabbix come from? Not Germany? Not France, not Estonia, not Russia. Who said Latvia? Okay, you get a candy. And it's Latvian candy. And it's with Riga black balsam in it. So, there you go. I'll start talking about Zabbix. What has changed during the past 2 years, not just 1 year. And then I'll discuss potential concerns about how open the processes are. Again, that's an outside look, so that's what it looks like to me from the outside. Another question, anybody has an idea or a guess in which year did the first public release of Zabbix happen?
2002?
Not 2002, but that's pretty close. Okay, who said that? 2001? Guys, you're just sitting there next to one another. You're just sharing all the candy then. So, please pass that. Thank you. Zabbix is very, very rapidly developed, and with the first release back in 2001, it's a pretty major solution. So there's many features. I will not be able even to cover all of the new features. So just some highlights from my point of view on this. Why 2 years? Because last time there was any Zabbix related talk at the OSMC, this conference was in 2015. That's 2 years ago. So let's cover whatever happened between then and now. Between then and now, 2 major versions were released because Zabbix uses 2 numbers as major version. 3.2, 3.4 got released. A major release means that there's a lot of new features, lots of new improvements. Zabbix, for me personally, is not a very big part of my daily duties anymore, but as I'm still using it, I'm trying to keep up with it, and I hope that I will be able to give a good overview of these features. First, one non-technical feature, and that is the support cycle, life cycle of Zabbix. You might know the concept from other products. Zabbix has also introduced something called long-term support releases or LTS releases. So there's a release which is an LTS, then 2 non-LTS releases, and then yet another release, which is again LTS. LTS releases get support for 5 years in total, and non-LTS releases are supported more or less until the next release is out. So it's like LTS release, 1, 2 non-LTS releases, LTS release again. planned to be released every 6 months, depending on any potential delays. Visual overview of how the supported versions work. So the red ones are LTS versions. As you can see, there's a pretty big overlap. So if you're looking to get to use the supported version, then you have a pretty big time window during which to migrate to the new LTS version that's released. The non-LTS versions, you have a shorter time span to do this, much shorter actually, but then you get access to new features sooner. So it's trade-offs in both cases a bit. The general functionality, of course, Zabbix does monitoring. It does monitor everything. There's just agentless native agent. There's web monitoring. Then it stores the data. Then it does the alerting, and it provides a user interface for visualizing the monitoring data as well. And let's try to get all of Zabbix features in one slide. So Zabbix is a true open source. That's not a technical feature, but it's a true open source, or it doesn't have this open core concept. Everything you download, all the code, that's the same that everybody else is using. There is no enterprise version, no proprietary plugins, because open core, it's not good. Not like I'm being very polite here. There's also a public promise to keep Zabbix open source. Native agent. Zabbix offers a native agent, so it's not Java or anything else. It's very lightweight. For example, on a 64-bit Linux system, excluding the shared libraries, Zabbix agent uses around 700 kilobytes of memory. It runs on nearly everything. I think AS400 is not included in that list, but everything else that most people are running is supported by the Zabbix agent. Browser-based user interface. Both for monitoring and configuration. Pretty much all of the configuration can be done through a user interface. There's a really awesome component of Zabbix called Zabbix Proxy. You can think of that as a remote data collector. It can collect data for you from branch offices, client sites, from DMZ, or just be used as a softening layer for performance reasons. Native support for JMX, for VMware, for web page monitoring, all built in. Agentless monitoring for the cases where you cannot install the Zabbix agent, so things like basic service checks, TCP ports, ICMP ping, and so on. Very, very easy to extend in the most simple way by running scripts to collect data, any language, no language restrictions, so Perl, Ruby, Python, anything more exotic. Some people write them in Java, anything, it's up to you. Alerting, email, SMS, Jabber, support comes out of the box, and a few others. Also very easy to extend, just send data to any SMS provider and so on. And of course, I lied, that's not all of the Zabbix features. There's many, many, many more. These are maybe just the ones that I would highlight. That's it. There's API and there's lots of other things that we will not even talk today about at all. So I'll jump over to the actual technical improvements, and the shiniest, the one that's most into the face of the users, is the dashboard improvements in recent versions of Zabbix. And previously, Zabbix dashboards were rather inflexible. They had useful information, but there was a fixed number of widgets. You could expand and collapse them and rearrange them a bit, and that was pretty much it. This has been completely reworked, and now it's maybe more similar to what people have come to expect from other products. So the dashboards, users now can configure the dashboards. There's a huge number of widgets compared to the previous dashboard at least. That can be added in the dashboard. Multiple dashboards can be created, and these can also be shared with other users. This is a screenshot of the new dashboard, which doesn't tell you that much, but you'll just have to believe me. It's much better. Another user interface related improvement, Zabbix has something called network maps. These are areas or images where you can put on elements and show real-time data like current load, network traffic. Links between the elements can change color depending on problem state. These previously were rendered PNG images, so it's not a bitmap, so they were not like terribly huge, but on slow links that maybe wasn't always a very fast operation to view a map. So the network maps have been improved. Now it's browser rendered SVG based on JSON data sent from the actual server. And the editing also is much easier. Map editing has pretty much improved in every release of Zabbix a little bit. It started being rather inflexible now. You can do things like copy, paste the elements. You can add custom shapes. Previously, you had to upload them as images. Now you can just draw a rectangle and put a current load in it, or have current time in ellipses, or any other fancy thing you'd like to do there. Another map-related new feature is something called map navigation tree, or map tree. You can put maps in a sort of hierarchical structure, and then the data will be aggregated upstream. So you will see the total number of problems of all the downstream maps, and there's a very easy navigation structure, a tree available as well. This was doable before, but it was in rather hackish ways. So now this is built in and very easy to do. Just add a couple of elements and it just works. That's it. Value preprocessing. So value preprocessing, at least in Zabbix, is a thing where a value that's received is manipulated in some way before storing this value in the database. And in previous versions of Zabbix, there was already delta calculation, either basic delta or change per second, commonly used with network traffic and other things like that. There was a custom multiplier, so if you got data in bytes, you needed bits, you multiplied by 8, or if you got something in kilobytes or megabytes from a storage array, you multiplied that to get bytes as the base unit in the database. And Zabbix could also convert automatically hex octal values and also Boolean things like true, false, TF into numeric values, into decimal values. This has been massively extended, and I would call it massively because now there are 3 new huge improvements. First, Zabbix now can do regular expression parsing as preprocessing, also XPath and JSON path. So regular expressions as preprocessing. This was available for log monitoring, so we could extract the value from a log entry and put that in an item. This has been now expanded to cover every item type that Zabbix supports. And the possibilities could start with something simple if you have a bad SNMP implementation, and most of the SNMP implementations somehow tend to be bad one way or another, unfortunately. Then if this implementation has temperature, space, degree sign, uppercase C, because they just don't know how to put out a raw number. Previously, you had to do some scripting to get the actual number in the Zabbix database. Now, this can be done natively, and data from some basic status pages like Apache or AJ Proxy can also be extracted without any additional scripting. You can just tell Zabbix, look for this regex, take this, and that's the value. As a quick example, if we have this temperature with the unit attached and it's as a string and we want to have the number, we have a regular expression, we have capture group looking for numbers, a second parameter tells just use the result of that capture group. And in the database, we have just the raw temperature value. So no scripting, all built in. Awesome. XPath and JSON path. This is very useful for more advanced status pages or maybe some API output and so on. That alone is very, very useful, but if you have a bigger status page, and if you use this extraction with either XPath, JSON path, or regex, then that would mean that every time you need one value from that bigger status page, Zabbix goes there and just reads that page, or file, or any other source. This is not needed anymore because along with these preprocessing options, Zabbix also introduced something called master items. A master item gets a value, which is the total value, for example, the whole status page, which is then referenced by things called dependent items. And these, as any other item, can use preprocessing. So in this example, we have a JSON, which is collected in the master item. Then we have 2 dependent items, which using JSON path are extracting the actual values from this JSON, and these are values that then are stored in the database. So not only there is no scripting needed anymore, the status page is actually processed or requested only once in this example. The great thing is also that this is extremely flexible because the preprocessing allows you to extract data in so many ways. There is no standard format that you would have to send the data, like special Zabbix format, into this master item. Any format that's parsable with these preprocessing options That's usable. And also the preprocessing options can be changed. So you could extract something with JSON path and multiply that and do some other things on top of that. So the preprocessing is extracting the values and storing them in database. But another new feature allows to extract values only for displaying purposes. And so let's say here we have, I have laser. So here we have an example of a log line, which then if this is stored in Zabbix, we might want to only see the actual error message. So if we have wrapped in curly braces Zabbix syntax for variables or macros, something called item.value, which just grabs the latest value from the item. Then the new function regsub, and as parameters regular expression with 2 capture groups, skipping the detail on what the capture groups do, but as the end result, we have just the error message, but only displayed. In the database, we still have the full log line for actually that came in from the file. Another change in Zabbix is that previously the polling frequency was specified as a number, and that number was in seconds, and you can only put numbers in there. This has been extended so that time suffixes like mh for minutes, hours, and so on are supported, which alone seems like a very tiny change. But first, that was a rather big change in how Zabbix internally structures these frequencies, how it caches them, and so on. And even bigger thing is that this also allows the use of variables or macros in the update frequency. And Zabbix has something called low-level discovery, or LLD, which allows to discover sub-entities of hosts of servers. For example, Zabbix comes with built-in discovery for network interfaces, for file systems, and a few others. And these discoveries, if they would be extended, they could give you the polling frequency for each of the individual items. So you could poll one file system, for example, more frequently than the other, and that would be completely automatic. There's no customization needed anymore. Even more, it also supports a thing called that Zabbix calls user macros, which are like user-definable variables. And this allows, as an example, there was one use case that was a bit of a problem over the years, where let's say you have one template, which is aggregating the checks and all the things that should be used, and you apply that to many hosts, servers, switches, and so on. And you could customize the alerting thresholds, for example, the time periods that should be alerted on. But you could never customize, at least in a reasonably maintainable way, the update frequency, the polling frequency. You could override it manually, but that was hard to manage afterwards. So what can be done now? The same template can be used on, let's say, core router, on the edge router, and on, let's say, some network printer. And all of these can have a variable that defines the polling frequency. Very easily, the same template, no customization on host level, just the variable and the polling frequency changes. So the benefit is that you would detect that the core router is out first, and you wouldn't get some first alert about the printer being unavailable or the edge router being unavailable. I've already used terms like host, item, and so on, and maybe a quick recap of what these are in Zabbix. So host is usually a network-attached device like server, switch, and so on. But a host alone does nothing. To collect data, Zabbix has items. Items are attached to hosts. Think of them as metrics. So CPU load, that's one item. Free memory, that's another item. Then a separate thing is a trigger, which is a problem expression which defines what a problem is. Why separate? Because the trigger can reference one item, it can reference multiple items on the same host, it can reference multiple items on different hosts. It's really, really flexible. And what triggers do, they define what a problem is. And then when actual thing happens, an event is generated, which is a timestamp occurrence of that specific problem condition evaluating to true. And that leads us into another new feature, which is called event tags. So these are defined on triggers. They have name and value. And then they propagate to all the downstream events that are generated by this trigger. One example where this is useful, let's say you have a log file which has entries about multiple applications or sub-applications, and they are started and stopped, and then you would like to alert about each of the individual applications separately. One option is to create separate triggers or these problem definitions that look for specific applications started, specific applications stopped. These become hard to manage, and especially if you have services that could be more dynamic and developers might be adding new ones frequently. That approach is not easy to manage. Having a single trigger that just checks for stopped and start doesn't work really well, because if you have one application that's stopped, it goes into problem state. The second application getting stopped, nothing happens. And similarly, when it's recovering, any application recovering would result in the problem resolving, and any application resolving the problem afterwards would get ignored. This is now possible to correlate with the tags, with a single item, single trigger. So what happens is that we assign to this first problem, when something is stopped, we assign a tag with name of application. So we identify what that tag is, and we have the application name in the tag. Then if another application gets stopped, it gets another tag assigned. As this is a different tag value, that's a separate problem now. It's not conflated with the previous one. Then when one of them is resolved, the same tag is applied. We extract the application name. We know which application got started back up. Zabbix goes back and looks which problems had this tag name combination and resolves those problems only. And similarly, when the other application gets resolved, then the specific problem is resolved there. This can go even more advanced, because it's not related to it could be not related to this same single trigger, the same single data source. You can have any data resolve any other problem, depending on how you decide to assign these tags, you decide to extract them. If this sounds a little bit confusing, that's rather normal, because this feature is extremely powerful, but it's maybe a bit not that trivial. In the Zabbix manual page about this feature, there's a big colored warning saying that, hey, this is kind of, be careful with what you do with this. Actually, that page has 2 warnings about this feature, like, be careful with this feature. We looked at we briefly talked about the dependencies before, where the edge router would depend on the core router, so that those are trigger dependencies. These tags, it's like dependencies on steroids. You can have lots of things affect other things inside a monitored environment. 2 additional improvements relate to the problem handling and acknowledging, and these have been requested by some users for quite some time, and they have finally arrived. Problems can now be manually resolved by the operator. So let's say if you have some data source that only sends problem values but never recovery values, you can have your network operations center people just resolve them manually once they have fixed the problem. If new values would come in that would show that there's still a problem, a new problem would be generated, so you cannot just silence things this way, but for things, let's say, like log files or SNMP traps, this would work pretty wonderfully. And another thing that also users were missing in Zabbix was built-in alerting upon acknowledgement. It was doable before with some scripting, but built-in, very easy now. You can send a message when somebody acknowledges a problem, or you could even run a command and do something else. JMX, who here is monitoring Java applications? Like 1/3 at least. Who is using JMX to monitor those applications? Not even all of those who monitored the Java applications before. So JMX is a built-in thing in Java, available for nearly, at least, I haven't seen a Java application that wouldn't have some beans possible to be made available. And Zabbix has a built-in JMX support using a separate component called Java Gateway. The limitation that was there was that only the RMI endpoint was supported. Unfortunately, JBoss a few versions ago already moved to remoting JMX. WebLogic uses different endpoint. So you had to patch the Java Gateway to actually be able to monitor anything besides RMI. This has been now improved, and now it's a fully customizable RMI endpoint. Sorry, not just RMI, but the JMX endpoint. So things like WebLogic, JBoss monitoring, there's no patching needed. Out of the box, things should work. Another the previously mentioned low-level discovery has been extended to cover JMX. So it's now possible to automatically discover beans, their properties, and monitor all of that. For people monitoring Java applications and in big enterprises, there's usually at least a few, if not all of them in Java. Both are extremely useful improvements. Talking about remote environments, let's say we have a Zabbix server on the left, we have a bunch of devices monitored. If it's all in the same network, all is good. If it's in a remote network, there's usually some problem in between. There's some firewall, some network topology problems. The Zabbix solution for that is the Zabbix Proxy, available for a very long time. Very awesome component, very robust, simple to set up. Think of it as a remote data collector. It can do everything Zabbix can. It can work with Zabbix agents, SNMP, JMX through the Java gateway, everything. It connects with the Zabbix server using a single TCP port. You decide which direction the connection goes, whether from the server to proxy or proxy to server. Very easy to configure firewalls. A very great solution. Another feature that Zabbix has is called remote commands. And when an agent on the right-hand side sends some data to the Zabbix server can decide to tell the agent to run some command. It's not just the agent commands, but let's take this as an example. And that works pretty well for some ad hoc resolving of problems in software where you don't get the actual software fixed right away. And if you use proxy, this slightly breaks, because what happens is that in previous versions, the data comes from the agent to the proxy, then to the server. Well, it doesn't really go over the firewall, but just to show the data flow, right? Zabbix will not let you circumvent firewalls. That's to be clear on that. So what happened with the remote commands, if the data indicates there's a problem and server goes, oh, I should tell the agent to fix something, it would try to connect to the agent directly. And of course, in remote environments, if there's actually a firewall in place, it will do this. It will block that operation of the remote command. And that has been improved now that when the data comes in that shows that there's a problem, Zabbix server tells the Zabbix proxy, you tell the Zabbix agent to do that thing. This was one of the top voted feature requests in Zabbix, so I'm really glad to see that one being implemented. Another big change is nested host group support. Previously, host grouping in Zabbix was flat. There was no nesting support. Now it's supported using this /separated syntax. So you could do it geographically, like Europe, Latvia, Riga, or functionally, like in this case, production DB, MySQL. When this feature appeared first, it was pretty rough. It didn't support most of the things people wanted to use it for. But luckily, this got expanded in subsequent releases. And now it's supported in all of these things. I will not go over them in detail, but it's now a majorly usable functionality. Another feature improvement is it's related to the log file monitoring, and Zabbix supports log file monitoring using the native agent. There are two older item keys, log/RT, for rotated log files, and they now have two new friends, log count and log/RT count. Instead of sending all of the lines in the log to Zabbix, they can count the lines that are matching the pattern, or any lines, or all of them. And then only send the number to the server. So that happens on the agent side, this calculation of the log lines. Given that Zabbix is not really aimed to be a log collection thing, this is really great, because you might have some cases where you don't really care. You know what the error message is. You don't need to see that error message like 20,000 times in your database in your log files. You just do the count and just send one number per definable time period to the server. People were doing this previously with some scripting. Now it's built in, much easier. For me personally, I've skipped actually monitoring the count in some cases and went to some log management tool. These two will make such cases much simpler to monitor. VMware monitoring. Who here is using, or whose company is using VMware? Absolute majority. And VMware monitoring has been built into Zabbix for quite a long time now. It got improved with a few new items, mostly regarding data center names, some sensor states, and data store items. And there are also performance improvements. So for VMware environments, these are very, very useful again. And now I'll go into maybe more lower level and smaller improvements. I'll concentrate not just on these big features, but also on things that make life easier for existing users and also for new users, of course. One change is that in Zabbix daemons previously, only POSIX extended regular expressions were supported. Now, Zabbix daemons support PCRE. So for all of your regex needs, look-aheads, look-behinds, other things, that's all supported finally. Zabbix also allows to export configuration data to XML and import it back. So things like hosts, templates, these can be exported to XML. Now that also includes the web scenarios. So it's more everything that host contains. Previously, web scenarios were excluded from this feature. And one thing that is very minor, but I've been personally very wanting to use something like that. Zabbix has a function count, which allows you in the incoming values to count how many are either matching a string or matching a specific number or bigger than or less than a number. And this has been extended and now it supports regex. So that's something I really wanted to use quite a few times, and that's available. Another area that I will raise that maybe most people wouldn't consider a big improvement, but I consider things that make a product easier to use, more stable and easier to debug problems to be very important, in many cases even more important than the actual feature additions. Because if a product has lots of features but is extremely to debug, that's not of a big use. So this shows that having such an improvement, such improvements shows that the developers are investing their time in non-shiny things and things that matter for users. And especially for things that are not happening every day. When you have to debug something, if the error messages are useless, that's not very, not the best case to be in. One minor thing, previously you could delete a user that was used in alerting, leaving some inconsistent configuration in place. There's some validation in that area and some other validation in place. There's more validation in the protocols between different Zabbix components. There's a reduced number of connections between Zabbix server and Zabbix proxy. The error messages have been improved, and that's one of those things that makes me really, really happy. Who here has never seen a misleading error message? Extremely happy people, right there, 2 of them. One thing is, of course, that error messages sometimes are just not helpful, and even worse, they can give you totally wrong reason. So Zabbix was like that in very, very old versions. It has been very steadily improving in this area, and the errors actually make sense. Resilience or stability of the product. Again, you could tune Zabbix to deal better with some misconfigurations, but now it does this out of the box by default. It keeps unneeded events for a smaller period of time. It even doesn't generate them in some cases if they would not be useful. Very minor thing, but previously if you change resolve.conf, you had to restart the Zabbix daemon on that system. Now that's not needed anymore. They follow the changes in this file automatically. Even more, agents, when they crash, they will log more information, which means that you will be able to provide more information to the developers, they'll be able to fix it, and hopefully agents will never crash then. Previously, IPMI, which is the Intelligent Platform Management Interface, if I'm not mistaken in the acronym, each of the processes that would connect to IPMI, they did their own connection. This is now changed, and there's only one process that is connecting to IPMI. This is much better because BMC's got the IPMI controllers were easy to overload. Alerting previously in Zabbix was sequential. So if you had lots of alerts or there was a slow media, the alerts could get backlogged and you wouldn't get timely notifications. Now alerting is parallel, so you can get spammed much faster. And one thing which is extremely important for Zabbix users, it's a very non-shiny thing, very, very low level. But previously, if an item broke in a way, for example, if a numeric item got a string, it became unsupported. If you had a trigger on this item that told you that there's no data, this would not work even on that item at that point because it's like not supported. You could alert about these not supported items appearing, but you could not easily direct those alerts to the team responsible for those systems. And in big environments, that was a problem. So that's now improved, and Zabbix can alert on any item, no matter how broken it may consider that item to be. Another usability area, in the user interface, lots of new filtering has been applied. This makes the interface easier to use, and again, I really love to see such improvements because it shows that developers might even be using the product and seeing the missing filtering functionality. So we talked about the upgrades a lot and new versions and so on, and how does the upgrade actually happen? And usually the answer is very easy. You upgrade to the new version of the software, you start the new Zabbix server, it automatically upgrades the database, it prints in the log file the status, the progress, and that's usually it. There are, of course, edge cases. If you have very big environments, things are not as easy, but there's quite a lot of effort put into the upgrade process as well. Another question. So people talk about the code, about the APIs, about protocols, and so on. What is often overlooked in the software development process? Documentation. You're getting more candy. I'll share it later. But yes, and that was also, it has been mentioned in quite a few talks here as well. Documentation is often overlooked, and I would claim that Zabbix has possibly one of the best documentation in the, at least open source world, and maybe even beyond that. So the manual is great. There's lots of information, and it's really described in enough detail in most of the cases. And there's also upgrade notes, so you can see what possibly breaking changes the new version will introduce. And you can see documentation for all of the versions of Zabbix, even like really old, not supported anymore. You can see documentation for the upcoming versions. Really awesome. A lot of great work going into the documentation of Zabbix. Then, moving on to Zabbix 4, which is the upcoming release. It's planned for the Q1 next year, first quarter, so sometime next year. If there might be some delays, maybe not, but next year definitely. Unfortunately, Zabbix does not publish the roadmap anymore. So if we would like to talk about what's coming, we'd have to look at the code changes and documentation changes possibly, and try to figure out what's happening that way. So I will not even do that, but that leads us to more sad, possibly topic today, and the second topic. So what is the openness? How you define that? Is that just the code? Is that the processes? What, like the community, how that all works? And the details matter. Some details matter more than they matter to other people. So what are those details? And this is an open conference, so let's be very open, and I'll try to give a very honest view on the openness. So the code is fully open. The development is fairly closed. You can follow it, but the external patches in Zabbix are not accepted in general. In most cases, there are very good reasons, because the patch only fixes the problem on one platform and breaks functionality on another platform, or it only fixes a specific problem, but it actually makes the software so much slower in other environments that it's not useful. So in those cases, the patches have to be rewritten, but even if the patch could be improved by the original submitter, there is no this feedback. So the community is not engaged in the development process much. And talking about the process, there might be a few things that actually look like Zabbix is closing up the processes somewhat. And let's look at the very specific example. Specifications. So Zabbix was writing specifications, detailed, I would even say great specifications for features, and they were freely shared before. In many cases, even in early draft states, community could get involved and maybe point out some problems even before they got codified in the specification or implemented. So yeah, these got closed, and what happened, one reason given was that there was not enough feedback, so no point publishing them. Another reason given was that there was too much feedback, so it took too much of the developer's time. And then later, it turned out that the specifications are advertised to paying tech support customers as an extra feature, as an extra data. And that is perfectly fine, because nobody can demand openness. The biggest problem that I would see is that there may be more honesty behind the reasons. So Zabbix gets more funding, maybe that way, maybe not. That's very hard to measure, I guess. But it would be, in my opinion, helpful to be honest with the community and tell them, hey, yeah, this application, we closed them because we would like to offer them as an extra benefit to the paying customers. In general, again, there's no demanding of openness. Even the forever open source, the public promise, that's not legally binding. That's just a promise to the users, to the community, to the customers as well. Zabbix might be looking at other examples that are worse even, and they're not like bad or terrible, but who's using Puppet? A few. Who's using a fully open source configuration management solution? Like no open core. I'm not fully sure, like 1 or 2 people. So yeah, Puppet is actually open core, and still it's considered open source and used by many. Similarly, the Elastic Stack. There are closed components. It's not fully open source. And I had this as a bad example, kind of, but I was very happy to see AWX open sourced earlier this year, probably more faster than anybody expected that. And so yeah, good job, Red Hat, on that. I think this is AWX logo. I'm not fully sure, or mascot or something, and that's also another cool thing about it, but that's a side topic. So talking about the openness and closeness, who is using syslog NG? 1, 2, 3. Who remembers syslog NG from before? More people. So why I'm saying from before, because nowadays, when I talk to people about the log centralized solutions and such things, most people, the first thing that they implement or think about or talk about, it's our syslog. And syslog NG was, and still is, I guess, open core. It had closed components. And what happened was that many platform vendors, or at least several important platform vendors, decided that it's not a good way forward, so they went with our syslog. And nowadays, at least from what I hear, our syslog is much, much more popular. It's quite possible that this trend of maybe slightly more closed development is nothing to worry about, and that Zabbix can still be a universal solution. The possible concern is that some users who would like to contribute more, or some platform vendors specifically, might turn away from Zabbix or might have a decreased preference for it. Yeah, but maybe that's not a concern, because Zabbix is still really, really great. And it is this true open source thing. It's free software. There's, again, no closed component. That is very, very important, because in many cases when you hear open source, you have to think, is that open core again? And it has really great functionality. It can monitor a lot of things. Lots of things are built in. Less need for scripting, less need for re-implementing things. The team behind Zabbix is really awesome. They're all great developers. And the community is wonderful and resilient. Yeah, so open core, I would not put that as a good thing. Yeah, and also Zabbix, I have this thing here which said, keep your feet warm and servers cool with Zabbix. And that's what I'm doing here. I have this Zabbix socks. So Zabbix has joined the trend. So yeah, Zabbix is great. I use it. I love it. I have the Zabbix socks. If there's anything you'd like to tell me about Zabbix or monitoring, any questions afterwards, then please find me on IRC. Zabbix channel on Freenode. It's probably still the biggest monitoring related IRC channel. Very friendly, very active, awesome place. On the blog, there's a contact form if you don't know how to join IRC. And later, if you don't get your question in now, then please come over and let me know what concerns you have. And we're at the question time.
Okay, so we have 50 minutes of question time. So, any questions for him?
Nice presentation, thank you. I'm not personally using Zabbix, but we have a team who is using it, and I was wondering, is there a way to integrate Zabbix with any other CMDB, like for instance, like PuppetDB, because Isinga can do this with Director. So could you share your experiences or impressions?
Yeah, I've never done such a integration myself, but there are solutions which use the Zabbix API. So when a change happens in the configuration, like system gets deployed or decommissioned or changes the role, this change goes to the Zabbix API. Hosts are created, templates linked, unlinked. Hosts could be deleted or disabled to be more safe. It's possible using the Zabbix API, which we didn't talk about today.
So there's no like built-in thing yet, or
no built-in thing yet. Yeah. That's correct.
Okay, any more questions?
Thank you. A great presentation. Just a following up question maybe on that CMDB kind of integration. For that relationship maps and the dependencies which you was showing up, is it possible to actually load them over the APIs as well? To actually say it's like if we maintain the dependencies and the kind of relationship between the object, like okay, this database hosted here and etc. Is it possible to load it into the maps as well?
You mean network maps?
Yeah, yeah.
Not automatically.
That's fine, not automatically, but is there possibility over the API to, for example...
API supports all of the configuration fully.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, well, actually, I think API was extended to support the thing called value maps in Zabbix, so that was a missing thing. But there, yeah, that's was a good. There was a when I said that API supports the configuration fully, there was an exclamation. There are still some global configuration things, like for example, if you'd like to customize the trigger names, what Zabbix calls warning, high, disaster, you cannot do that through API. That level of things is not available in API yet.
More questions? Okay, so...
so thanks a lot, and I think that means earlier lunch.
Yep, and you can exchange the candy. So one warm applause, please.